The rain came down in sheets that Thursday morning, the kind of cold, relentless New York rain that soaks through a jacket in 30 seconds and makes everyone on the sidewalk look slightly defeated. Puddles spread across the pavement outside a small coffee shop on 42nd Street, and the line inside had already curled past the door. People clutched their phones, shifted their weight, checked the time. Nobody looked at anyone else. That was the city's unspoken rule. You existed in your own lane. You moved forward. You got your coffee. You left. It was in that ordinary, forgettable morning that Daniel Carter stood near the back of the line, collar damp, boots darkened at the toe from a puddle he hadn't managed to avoid, counting exactly $12 in his wallet and deciding, as he did every morning, whether today he would eat a real breakfast or just drink his coffee and survive until lunch. He always chose the coffee. He told himself it was preference. It wasn't. Daniel was 38 years old, though some mornings he felt closer to 50. Not in a bitter way, he wasn't a man given to bitterness, but in the way that grief adds invisible weight to a person, settling into the joints, slowing the step just slightly. 3 years had passed since his wife, Ellen, died of an illness that had taken 14 months to take her, and in those 14 months, Daniel had learned more about hospital corridors and insurance paperwork, and the specific silence of a house at 3 in the morning than any person should ever have to learn. Their son, Marcus, was 20 now, living with his grandparents across the state. Enrolled in a university program he was genuinely excited about. Daniel called him every Sunday. They talked about basketball, about Marcus's classes, about nothing in particular. It was enough. It had to be enough. The apartment Daniel rented was small, 1 bedroom, radiator that clanged through the winter nights, a window that looked out at a brick wall, and it cost him just enough each month that money was always a calculation, never a comfort. He worked building maintenance at Harrington Tower, a gleaming 40-story office building in Midtown that housed advertising firms, law offices, a private equity group on the 32nd floor, and, as of 6 months ago, the new satellite headquarters of Hayes Technologies on floors 28 through 31. His days were built from tasks that most people never thought about. The elevator on the south side that ran half a second slow, the fluorescent panel in the 3rd floor conference room that buzzed faintly at certain hours, the loading dock door whose sensor needed recalibration every few weeks. He was good at his job. He was quiet about it, thorough, always early. His supervisor had told him more than once that Daniel was the most reliable person on the team. Daniel had thanked him and gone back to work. He didn't need to be told. He already knew. He had arrived early that Thursday because of a work order, a pressure issue in the 6th floor mechanical room that needed to be checked before the building filled up. He'd taken care of it by 7:45. And now he stood in line at the coffee shop on the corner, still wearing his Navy maintenance uniform, a damp jacket over it, waiting for a medium black coffee that would cost him $2.75. That would leave him $9.25 for the rest of the day. He'd already done the math 3 times without meaning to. 2 people ahead of him in line stood a woman he almost didn't notice. She was dressed plainly dark jeans, a simple charcoal coat, no umbrella, her dark hair slightly damp and pulled back without much thought. No jewelry that he could see, no makeup. She carried a structured leather bag over one shoulder, the kind that was expensive in a quiet way, though Daniel wouldn't have known how to place the price. She was staring at the menu board above the counter with the focused expression of someone who was deciding, which was the expression most people in line wore. Nothing about her announced itself. She looked, if anything, slightly tired. Her name was Victoria Hayes. She was 36 years old. She was the founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Technologies, a company currently valued at $4.7 billion, with offices in 9 cities across 3 continents. She had appeared on the cover of Forbes twice, been named to Fortune's list of most powerful women in business 4 years running, and had given a keynote at a global technology conference in Geneva last spring that was still being quoted in industry publications. She had 347 employees, whose livelihoods depended on decisions she made. She had a penthouse apartment 12 blocks north. She had a car and a driver. She had a personal assistant named Claire who managed her calendar with military precision. None of that was present this morning. Claire had been stuck in a subway delay since 7:30, still 20 minutes out, when Victoria had finally given up waiting and walked into the rain. Her phone had died somewhere between the taxi she'd hailed, and the moment she realized the taxi driver wasn't taking the right route and she'd gotten out 2 blocks early to walk. And her wallet, her actual wallet, the slim card holder she kept in the outer pocket of her bag, was gone. She discovered this the moment she reached the front of the line, set her bag on the counter to search through it, and found nothing where the wallet should have been. A crowded subway platform. She had a feeling she knew when it had happened. She just hadn't felt it. The cashier, a young man with patient eyes, waited. The people behind Victoria did not wait with the same patience. She could hear the shift in energy before anyone spoke, the exhale, the shuffle, the weight of impatience accumulating behind her. She checked the bag again, then again. The barista offered to hold her order while she sorted it out, which was kind, but it didn't solve the problem. Her phone was dead, so she couldn't use a payment app. She didn't have a backup card on her. She was standing in a coffee shop in the rain with no wallet, no phone, and no assistant. And around her were 22 people who wanted to get their coffee and get to work, and not one of them was looking at her with anything resembling sympathy. If you can't pay, you should step aside. The voice came from somewhere in the middle of the line. Not mean, exactly, just blunt, in the way that New York sometimes was. The city's patience had limits, and those limits were visible on busy weekday mornings. Victoria straightened. She was about to say something she wasn't sure what, an apology, an explanation, when the person directly behind her stepped forward. He was a man in a navy jacket, damp at the shoulders, with dark eyes and a calm face, and the unhurried manner of someone who had simply decided what to do and was doing it. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't make eye contact with the crowd. He looked at the cashier and said, quietly, and without any fuss at all, "I've got it. Whatever she ordered, and a medium black for me." He put a $10 bill on the counter. The cashier nodded and started moving again. The line moved. The moment passed. Victoria turned to look at the man beside her, and he was already tucking his wallet back into his jacket pocket. She noticed how thin that wallet was, how deliberate the motion, and he glanced at her with an expression that was warm without being performative. Not a smile designed to be noticed. Just a quiet acknowledgement between two people standing in the same rain. "Thank you," she said. Can I get your account information? I'll transfer it back to you immediately." He shook his head, and the corner of his mouth lifted. "It's just a cup of coffee." "I insist," she said. I have my card at the office. You don't need to," he said. And there was no edge to it, no performance of generosity. He said it the way you'd tell someone the rain was stopping, just a fact. "It happens. Hope your morning gets better." He picked up his coffee when it came, gave the cashier a brief nod, and walked out into the rain. Victoria stood at the counter holding a coffee she hadn't paid for, watching the door close behind a stranger whose name she didn't know, and she realized after a moment that she had absolutely no idea what to do with what had just happened. She stood there longer than she needed to. Victoria Hayes had built a company from a single product idea she'd coded in a studio apartment at 24, raised venture capital when people told her the market was too crowded, pivoted twice when the data told her to, and navigated a hostile acquisition attempt 2 years ago that had taken 4 months and cost her a vice president she'd trusted with everything. She was not easily unsettled. She handled boardrooms and earnings calls and difficult conversations with the steadiness of someone who had trained herself never to flinch. But she stood in that coffee shop for a long moment, coffee warming her hands through the cardboard sleeve, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. A specific, quiet surprise, the kind that comes not from something dramatic, but from something small being exactly opposite to what you expected. She walked out into the rain. He was already gone. The Hayes Technologies satellite office occupied 4 floors of Harrington Tower, and Victoria arrived there 90 minutes later than planned, which was itself unusual enough to draw glances from the 2 executives who were waiting for her in the lobby. She apologized briefly, sent Claire, who had finally arrived, to get her a replacement phone charger, and spent the rest of the morning in back-to-back meetings that required her full attention. She gave it. She was professional. She was sharp. But somewhere in the margin of the day, between the 11 o'clock call with their engineering lead and the lunch that got postponed to 12:30, she kept returning to the image of a man in a wet jacket, putting a $10 bill on a counter without hesitation and saying, "It's just a cup of coffee." She didn't know why it stayed with her. She was not sentimental by nature. She had learned early that sentiment was expensive. It clouded judgment, created vulnerabilities, opened doors that were difficult to close. She had built her life on clarity and forward motion. She was not the kind of person who got rattled by small kindnesses from strangers. She had received many things from many people over the years: gifts, flattery, favors, loyalty, both real and performed, and she had learned to categorize them quickly, assess their intent, and file them accordingly. But the man at the coffee shop had wanted nothing. She had nothing to offer him in that moment. He hadn't known who she was. He had simply, without calculation, without audience, without even seeming to consider the alternative, decided to help. The building inspection she had scheduled for the following week got moved up to the next morning. Claire noted the change and rearranged 2 calls without asking for an explanation. Victoria didn't offer one. She arrived at Harrington Tower the following Tuesday with her property manager and 2 members of her facilities team. She was evaluating the building's maintenance infrastructure as part of due diligence for a long-term lease extension. Hayes Technologies was considering making this location their primary East Coast hub, and that meant understanding the building's operational capacity at a granular level. She had done her homework. She always did. But walking through the service corridors and mechanical rooms and checking on the electrical panels and HVAC systems was something she preferred to see in person, and she had learned that the most informative conversations in a building were but with managers, but with the people who actually fixed things. She was in the basement mechanical room, listening to her property manager explain the age of the central air handling unit, when she heard a voice from further back in the room, calm, focused, talking a younger colleague through something, and patient in the way of someone who had explained the same thing before and did not mind explaining it again. She looked past the ductwork and saw a man in a Navy maintenance uniform crouched beside a secondary pump assembly. One hand braced on the housing, pointing at something with a small flashlight. He had dark hair and an unhurried manner that she recognized before she recognized his face. She recognized his face a moment later. He looked up. Not because she'd called his name, she didn't know his name, but because he'd registered the presence of someone new in his space, the way maintenance workers learn to notice the arrival of unfamiliar footsteps. He saw her, and she watched his expression move through recognition and then settle into something neutral and pleasant. He stood, tucked the flashlight into his chest pocket, and nodded. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He didn't react. He didn't straighten his posture, or change his tone, or do any of the things that people did when they suddenly realized they were talking to someone important. She was, she knew, in her inspection clothes today, professional but not formal. No visible indication of her role beyond the fact that she was clearly not a maintenance worker. He looked at her with the same steadiness he'd shown at the coffee counter. She found it, inexplicably, steadying. They spoke for 4 minutes about the pump assembly. He answered her questions directly, without oversimplification or condescension, explained what was working and what was aging, and told her honestly that the unit would need a full replacement in 18 to 24 months, regardless of how well it was maintained between now and then. His colleague stood nearby, quiet and watching. When Victoria thanked him, he nodded again and turned back to the pump. And that was that. She walked back through the service corridor and said nothing to her property manager for a full 30 seconds. His name, according to the building staff directory that Claire pulled up that afternoon, was Daniel Carter, 38. Senior maintenance technician, 5 years at the building. She told Claire that was all she needed, and then sat at her desk for a moment with the directory still on her screen. She didn't need the directory, technically. She had what she needed, and yet she found herself reading the single line of information twice. She told herself she was curious in the way she was curious about anything relevant to the building's operations. She almost believed it. What she did next was not something she had planned or particularly approved of in herself. She asked Claire to look into Daniel Carter's general work history at the building, nothing invasive, just professional references. Conduct record. Colleague assessments. She framed it as part of standard due diligence for a lease extension, which was not entirely false. Claire returned with a summary within a day. The summary was brief and contained 4 things that stood out. Daniel Carter had never received a disciplinary notice in 5 years. He had twice covered shifts for colleagues going through personal hardships, without being asked and without requesting compensation. He was documented in 3 separate notes from building residents as having repaired minor household items, a loose railing fixture, a jammed window frame, a faulty intercom for elderly residents on floors where he worked, at no charge and on his own time, and his former supervisor, who had retired the previous year, had written in an exit assessment that Daniel was, quote, the most quietly reliable person he had ever managed. Victoria read the summary twice. She put it down. She picked it up and read it again. She was not naive. She understood that documented records showed the surface of a person, not the interior. But she had spent 15 years learning to read people. And the pattern in Daniel Carter's record was not the pattern of someone performing goodness for an audience. It was the pattern of someone who simply operated that way. Consistently, across contexts, when no one was watching and nothing was owed. She thought about the coffee counter. She thought about $12 in a thin wallet. For the first time and longer than she could comfortably name, she wanted to have a conversation with someone that had nothing to do with strategy. The lease extension gave her reason to visit the building 3 more times over the following 3 weeks. And on each of those visits, in the way of things that happen when 2 people occupy the same building and are both, in their separate ways, attentive to their surroundings, she encountered Daniel. Not engineered encounters, or not entirely. The first time he was eating lunch on a bench near the loading dock, a sandwich and a paperback book, and she paused to ask what he was reading. He told her. A history of the Apollo program. For the 3rd time, because he found something new in it, each read. She had read it once. In college. They talked about the chapter on the guidance computer for 7 minutes. She arrived 4 minutes late to her next meeting. The second time he was in the elevator lobby on the 29th floor, checking the door sensor on the north elevator, and she stopped to ask whether the intermittent slowdown she'd noticed was a mechanical issue or a software calibration problem. He explained it clearly, a worn guide rail bushing, scheduled for replacement that Friday, and then, because she asked, went a level deeper into how the system worked, drawing a quick diagram on the notepad he kept in his breast pocket. She had not been particularly interested in elevator mechanics before that conversation. She was interested now. The 3rd time was different. They were both in the building's small ground floor lobby at the same moment, both heading for the door, both without an umbrella, both looking at the rain that had restarted with the particular determination of a New York October. He glanced at her and said, "You're seeing a lot of rain lately." She laughed an actual laugh. Not the polished professional sound she produced at events, but the surprised, unguarded kind. "I think I attract it," she said. He held the door open, looked at the sky with the resigned expression of someone who had stopped fighting weather a long time ago, and said, "I find it easier to like once you've decided you don't mind getting wet." She stood in the rain for a moment, after he walked away, not minding it at all. She did not tell anyone about these conversations. She didn't see why she would. They were small things. She was not a person who read meaning into small things. She catalogued them carefully, in a part of herself she kept apart from her professional identity. And she did not examine them closely, because examining them closely would require naming what they were, and she was not quite ready to do that. Daniel, for his part, noticed the woman he'd bought coffee for in exactly the way he noticed most things. Clearly, without interference, without projection. He didn't know who she was beyond her association with the Hayes Technologies offices. He'd understood from her manner and her questions, and the way the building manager deferred to her, that she held a position of some authority. But he hadn't thought much beyond that. She was smart, that much was immediately clear, and she asked good questions. The kind that came from genuine curiosity, rather than performance. She was also, he had noticed, quite alone in a way that had nothing to do with whether people were physically around her. He had seen that kind before. He had been that kind himself. For a long time. He recognized it the way you recognize a familiar weather pattern, not because you were looking for it, but because you'd lived inside it long enough to know its shape. He didn't push toward anything. He was not a person who pushed. He went to work. He did his job. He read his books and called Marcus on Sundays, and made coffee in his quiet apartment and watched the city from his one window. And if he thought sometimes about what it would mean to have someone to talk to in the evenings, someone who asked the kinds of questions the woman from the building sometimes asked, he let the thought pass the way most thoughts passed. Without drama. Without dwelling. The thing he could not have predicted was that the story had already left the building. In the third week of October, a member of Hayes Technologies' board of directors, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had been trying for 18 months to engineer a majority coalition that would force Victoria out of the chief executive role and position the company for a sale he stood to benefit from, significantly became aware that Victoria was spending notable time in the building during site visits. His contact inside the building, a mid-level property manager with a grudge and a financial motive, reported the informal conversations between Victoria and the maintenance technician. Whitmore's communications team shaped what they knew into something that would spread. That the CEO of Hayes Technologies was pursuing an inappropriate relationship with a building employee, that her judgment was compromised. That the company's leadership was unstable. The initial report appeared in a financial gossip column on a Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday morning, it had been picked up by 3 technology news outlets and 1 mainstream business publication. It was framed with the careful hedging of things that cannot be proven, sources close to the board, questions have been raised, insiders describe a concerning pattern, but the damage of a story like that is not in its specifics. It's in the image it creates, the association it builds between a name and a kind of disorder. Victoria was known for precision, for control, for decisions made from data. The story was designed to unravel that image and replace it with something smaller and more easily dismissed. Daniel learned about it from a colleague who showed him a headline on his phone in the break room Thursday morning. He read it once. He read it again. He felt the specific, hollow discomfort of seeing himself become a story, not his actual self, but a version of himself made of inference and implication, reduced to a plot function in someone else's agenda. The headline used his job title like a slur. It used the phrase inappropriate closeness, which was a careful construction designed to imply everything and prove nothing, the kind of language built specifically to survive denial. He thought about what Ellen would have said. She would have been practical about it. She always had been, even in the hospital, even in the hard months. Always practical first and emotional second, moving toward the thing that could actually be done. What can be done? She would have asked. Not what is fair, not what is deserved, but what can you actually do right now with what you have? He sat with that for a few minutes, drinking his coffee, the break room quiet around him, the headline still glowing on his colleague's phone face down on the table, and then he did what he had learned to do when the thing in front of him was larger than his ability to fix it. He tried to figure out what he could control. He went to human resources before lunch and submitted his resignation, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. He said he didn't want to cause any further disruption to the organization. The HR manager looked uncomfortable and said they'd need to process it, and Daniel said that was fine. He cleaned out his locker, which didn't take long. He had never been someone who accumulated things in workplaces, keeping only the tools he used daily, and a small photograph of Marcus from his freshman orientation, standing in front of his dormitory, squinting into the sun with a backpack that was clearly too large for his frame. Daniel folded the photograph carefully and put it in his shirt pocket and left the locker empty. He was on the sidewalk by 1:30 in the afternoon, the same sidewalk he'd walked every morning for 5 years, and it felt different under his feet, in the way that familiar places always feel different when you know you're leaving them. He stood for a moment in the October air, looking up at the building's glass face, and then he put his collar up against the cold and walked. He had not tried to contact Victoria. He did not have her number. He would not have used it if he had. She was dealing with something that was, by any measure, significantly larger than his discomfort, and he did not think making it about himself would help her. He found a temporary position at a small repair shop. 2 neighborhoods over the owner was an old man named Roy, who'd been fixing household appliances and small machinery for 37 years and needed help on the floor, 3 days a week. It wasn't much, but it was something to do with his hands while he figured out next steps. And Daniel had always found that having something to do with his hands helped him think more clearly. Roy was the kind of man who didn't ask many questions, which Daniel appreciated. On the first day, Roy had watched him work for about 20 minutes, then gone back to the front of the shop. And Daniel had understood that to mean he was hired. They got along well. Roy kept a small radio behind the counter that played classic country music at a volume just low enough to ignore. And they worked most mornings in a companionable quiet that Daniel found genuinely restorative. Victoria found out he had resigned on Friday afternoon. When she called the building manager to ask about a facilities question, and was told, almost in passing, that one of the maintenance team had stepped down the day before. She knew immediately which one. She asked for confirmation. She sat with the information for approximately 45 seconds before standing up and asking Claire to cancel her 3 o'clock. She spent the weekend doing what she always did when the external pressure was loudest. She got quiet, and she thought, and she made a decision. The decision was not complicated once she let herself make it clearly. Whitmore's play was about leverage, and the only way to neutralize leverage was to remove the ambiguity it was built on. The story he'd circulated survived because it was a vacuum, no facts to displace it. Just implication and silence. She would fill the vacuum herself. Finding Daniel took most of Saturday. His apartment had been vacated. She learned this from a building manager who recognized her name and was immediately cooperative, which was a function of power she registered with her usual complicated feeling. On Sunday afternoon, following a lead from Roy's shop address, which Claire had traced through a business license database, Victoria took a cab to a narrow street in a neighborhood she'd passed through but never stopped in, and found a repair shop with a hand-painted sign and a door that still used a physical bell when it opened. Daniel was behind the counter, glasses on. She hadn't seen him wear glasses before examining the internal mechanism of a vintage table lamp that Roy had set aside for him. He heard the bell, looked up, and saw her standing in the doorway in the autumn light. And something crossed his face that was not surprise exactly, but was close to it. He took off his glasses. "You found me," he said. "I did," she said. She stepped inside. The shop smelled of oil and old metal, and faintly, of the coffee from a pot Roy had left on the small burner in the back. It was warm inside. The rain had started again outside, the first rain of what would become a long autumn, coming down soft and steady against the windows. "You didn't have to resign," she said. "I didn't want to be part of the problem," he said. "You weren't the problem." He looked at her for a moment, and then said, "You should probably know. I have no idea how any of that works, board politics, stock implications, whatever the actual situation is. I just knew my presence was being used as a weapon against you, and I didn't want that." She sat down on the wooden stool beside the counter, which she suspected was Roy's stool, and which she used without asking because she needed to sit down. "There's something I should tell you," she said. "I own Hayes Technologies. I'm the CEO. The company whose offices are in Harrington Tower, that's mine. I should have said something earlier. She paused. "I wasn't sure how to be around someone who didn't know who I was. I was enjoying it." Daniel was quiet for a moment. And then he smiled, a real one. The kind that moves from the mouth to the eyes, and said, "So that cup of coffee was pretty expensive." Then, Victoria laughed. She hadn't laughed like that in months. It came up from somewhere she'd sealed off without quite realizing it. And it surprised her. And she let it. "No," she said. And her voice was different now. Quieter. "It was the best investment I've ever made." The following week was difficult for Hayes Technologies by any external measure. Whitmore's coalition made formal noises about a board review. Two technology analysts downgraded their outlook for the stock. The financial press circulated the story across another news cycle. And in the middle of all of it, Victoria held a press conference that was not about earnings or product launches or market positioning. She stood in front of a room of journalists without prepared remarks beyond a single page of bullet points she'd written herself, and she told the story of a Thursday morning in October when she'd lost her wallet in a coffee shop and a maintenance worker who'd been up since 6 a.m. to fix a pressure valve had spent most of his remaining cash on a cup of coffee for a stranger who couldn't pay. She was precise about the facts. She was calm about the context. She said, clearly and without hedging, that Daniel Carter was a man of uncommon integrity who had been put in an impossible position by people who found his decency inconvenient. She said the board review was a governance mechanism she welcomed because governance was built on transparency, and she had no interest in conducting her leadership any other way. She said Hayes Technologies would continue as it was because what it was had been built on something real, and she had not forgotten what that was. The room was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then the questions started. But the story had already changed shape. The original account had been small and targeted and designed for a specific audience. Victoria's version was larger and human and aimed at everyone, and it moved through the press cycle with the speed of things that feel true because they are. The maintenance worker who spent his last dollars on a CEO's coffee and then quietly resigned to protect her. The CEO who tracked him down in a repair shop 2 neighborhoods over to say it wasn't his fault. By the time the third wave of coverage arrived, Whitmore's coalition was dealing with a very different public narrative than the one they had started with. The stock recovered by the end of the following week. 3 board members who had been sitting quietly with their options made phone calls that suggested they were no longer inclined to back a play that now looked, in public light, like the kind of corporate maneuvering that made shareholders nervous about leadership culture. What Victoria did not say publicly, what she kept for herself, filed in the interior place where she kept things that were too important to expose to the press, was that the act of standing up and telling that story had done something to her that she hadn't anticipated. She had gone into the press conference as a strategic exercise. She had come out of it feeling lighter. There was a word for that, and she knew what it was. And it was not a word she used in boardrooms. Relief. The relief of having said something true in a room where truth was not always the operating currency. The relief of having decided, finally, that some things were worth defending not because they were strategic but simply because they were right. She sat in the back of the car afterward, watching the city move past the window, and she thought about all the years she had spent managing her image, managing perception, managing the distance between what she knew to be real and what she allowed the world to see. It was exhausting work. She had become very good at it, but she was tired of it in the way you get tired of carrying something heavy, not suddenly, but cumulatively, the weight finally visible once you'd set it down. Gerald Whitmore submitted his resignation from the board in November, citing health reasons. The press was polite about it. Victoria called Daniel the evening after the press conference. He had heard about it. Roy had shown him the news on a tablet propped against a broken toaster, and he'd felt something shift inside him that he didn't immediately have a word for. When she called, he answered after 2 rings. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Are you?" "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think so." There was a pause, and then she asked if he wanted to get coffee. "The real kind," she said. Sitting down. She was paying. He said yes. They met the following Saturday at the same coffee shop on 42nd Street where it had started, which was her suggestion and which he accepted without comment. Though he noticed the choice and felt that it mattered. She was there when he arrived, already seated at a table by the window. And she was in the kind of simple clothes she'd worn the first morning: jeans, a soft sweater, no visible marker of the company, or the position, or the public persona. She was just a person at a table by a window, watching the street. She looked, he thought, easier than she had looked in the building. Like something had been allowed to rest. They stayed for 3 hours. The coffee went cold twice and was replaced. He talked about Ellen not the way he sometimes did. briefly, and with the careful flatness of someone who has packaged a large thing into something small enough to carry in public but more fully, in the way you talk about someone when the other person is genuinely listening and you feel that being felt. He talked about the 14 months, and what those months had taught him about what mattered and what didn't, and the strange, unexpected freedom that came from having gone through the worst thing and still being there on the other side, still able to make coffee in the morning and notice the light on the water and fix a broken elevator and feel, most days, something like gratitude for the complicated fact of being alive. He talked about why he helped people when he could. He had thought about this for a long time, and the answer was simple, though it had taken time to arrive at. When you have been held up by another person at the moment you needed it most, the only real response is to hold up the next person you can, not as transaction, not as virtue performance, just as the basic human motion of passing something forward. Victoria listened to all of it. And then she told him things she hadn't said out loud, in longer than she'd been conscious of not saying them. She talked about the year she'd incorporated the company, 24 years old, and running on 4 hours of sleep, and the specific terror of someone who has committed entirely to a thing and can no longer see the floor beneath them. She talked about the acquisition attempt 2 years ago, and the person she'd had to become during those 4 months harder, faster, more purely strategic, and how she had come out of it having won, but also having lost something she hadn't known she was putting at risk. She talked about the insomnia that had been a constant companion for 3 years, and how she sometimes sat in her penthouse at 2 in the morning and looked out at the city and felt, underneath all the evidence of her success, a specific and inarticulate loneliness that had no obvious solution, and that she had largely stopped looking for solutions to. She had stopped believing that what she needed could simply be acquired. That was the rational conclusion. And she was a rational person. "And then someone bought you a cup of coffee," Daniel said. "And then someone bought me a cup of coffee," she said. It was not a solution. It was a small thing. But small things had a way, she had learned, of standing in for larger truths. The coffee was never about the coffee. It was about being seen, without context or calculation, by someone who had nothing to gain and offered something anyway. It was about the particular surprise of generosity that asks nothing back. She had spent years building a life in which everything had a context, a value, a position in a larger system, and for one moment in a coffee shop on a Thursday morning, she had stood outside all of that and been simply a person in the rain who needed help. And someone had helped her. She had not known how much she needed to be that simple. She reached across the table and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him. "I have no idea what this is," she said, honestly. "I want you to know that. I don't have a plan for this one." He looked at her across the small table, in the afternoon light coming through the coffee shop window, and he said, "That's all right. Neither do I." A year passed in the way that good years pass, not in a blur, but with the quality of something that is both happening and being noticed at the same time, each part of it held with a little more attention than usual. Fall became winter, became a New York spring that arrived tentatively, and then, all at once, the trees in the park suddenly and aggressively green, the light lasting into the evenings. Daniel got into the habit of cooking dinner on the weekends, something he hadn't done in years, proper meals, not the reheated things he'd assembled in the dark of his single-man apartment. He called Marcus more often, and their conversations grew longer, took unexpected turns, touched on things they hadn't talked about since Ellen was alive. Marcus told him once, midway through a Sunday call, that he seemed different. "Good different," his son said. "Like you're somewhere, instead of just being somewhere and waiting to leave." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window at the late evening light on the street below and said that was about right. Victoria navigated the board transition that followed Whitmore's departure with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything, brought in 2 new independent directors she trusted, and began the planning phase of the company's East Coast expansion with cleaner air around the process than she'd had in a long time. She slept better. Not perfectly, she was still the person who woke at 3 in the morning sometimes, still the person for whom the gap between ambition and completion was a source of low-grade permanent energy, but better. She called Daniel on most evenings. Not about anything in particular, in the way that people who have found each other call. Because calling is a way of saying, "You're part of the structure of my day now, and the day is better with you in it." They met at the coffee shop on 42nd Street on a Saturday in October, a year to the week from when they'd first stood in line together in the rain. She was already there when he arrived. She was almost always there first. It was simply her nature, and she had ordered for both of them, his medium black and her cappuccino, and they were on the small table by the window, and the window was rain-blurred in the way of early autumn windows. The street outside soft and gray and moving. He saw her through the glass before he opened the door, and for a moment he stood on the sidewalk in the rain, just looking at her, at the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, at the way her attention was already out on the street. Watching, always watching, the particular alertness of someone who had taught herself never to stop paying attention, and he felt the same thing he always felt in these moments, a quiet, private gratitude that he had learned to stop questioning and simply accept that this had happened, that he was here, that she was there, on the other side of the glass, waiting for him. Daniel sat down across from her and reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and set something on the table between them. It was a paper receipt, folded once, softened at the creases from having been folded and unfolded over a long time. She looked at it. 2 coffees, $3.50. A Thursday in October. It was so small. She had never thought about how small a receipt was until this moment, how much weight something so thin and transient could carry, how a gesture that lasted 30 seconds could print itself so permanently into the structure of 2 lives. "You kept it," she said. "I kept it," he said. She looked at him across the table. Why? He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was thinking about something he'd thought about before and was giving it the proper weight again. "To remind myself," he said, "that the smallest thing you do for another person can change the direction of a life. Yours, theirs, sometimes both." He turned the receipt over in his fingers. "I'm not a philosopher. I don't have a big theory about it. I just know that when I stood in that line, and I saw someone having a bad morning, I had a choice. That's all it was, a choice, and I'm glad I made it." Victoria looked at the receipt on the table between them. She thought about the Thursday morning that had begun with a stolen wallet and a dead phone and strangers' impatience, and had sent her out into the rain holding a coffee someone had paid for with his last dollars. Bewildered by it, in a way she was not used to being bewildered. She thought about walking through a building and finding him again, and about all the small conversations that had built, one on top of another, into something she had not expected to have room for in her life, and had turned out to have been waiting for without knowing it. She thought about the press conference she had given not out of strategy but out of a desire to tell the truth about what she had seen. She thought about what it meant to be known by someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to gain and saw you anyway, clearly and without interference, and decided you were worth showing up for. She thought about all the years she had spent believing that the shape of a life was determined by the large things, the decisions, the pivots, the acquisitions, the losses that required restructuring, the victories that required defending. She had been right, in a way. Large things mattered. But she had been wrong to think that the small things were merely scaffolding, merely the connective tissue between the real moments. She understood now, and this was not a thought she had arrived at through logic, but through the accumulated experience of a year of small moments with a quiet man who fixed elevators and read about the Apollo program and called his son on Sundays, that the small things were not scaffolding at all. They were load-bearing. They were the architecture. A cup of coffee on a rainy Thursday morning. A $10 bill placed on a counter without calculation. A door held open. A question asked with genuine curiosity. A phone call made because the day is better when the other person is in it. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Outside the window, the rain was falling, the soft, steady rain of an early October morning. The kind that blurs the edges of the city and makes everything inside feel more present, more lit. People moved along the sidewalk with their umbrellas and their coffees, headed somewhere, hurrying, living their own layered invisible stories. Two people sat in a coffee shop by a window. One of them had built a company worth billions. One of them spent his days making sure elevators ran and lights stayed on. Between them, folded once on a small wooden table, was a receipt for $3.50 that had started something neither of them could have predicted or planned. He turned his hand over beneath hers. She kept holding it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. And in that moment, the rain and the light and the warmth of the small shop and the sound of the city moving outside all settled into something that felt, if not like permanence, then at least like enough, like exactly enough. The rain came down outside, even and unhurried, and inside the small shop the light was warm, and there was nothing that needed to be fixed or solved or navigated right now. Only this: two people who had been lonely and were not anymore, sitting quietly in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of having found each other in a city of millions. Because of a cup of coffee and the simple, ancient, inexhaustible decision to be kind. Kindness costs little, but it can change everything.